Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman, and we're here with another video to help you improve your chess game. Today I thought I'd do some stuff on analysis. We're going to talk about some of the elements of analysis, maybe go through analysis in slow motion. And I thought I'd start with a position that I was familiar with because I went over with a game that my student played. And then I'll try to pick one that I'm not so familiar with so we can kind of do it fresh. All right, so it's white's move in this position. And the question is, how do you start your analysis? Well, if you've never seen the position before, like if it's a puzzle or you're not in the middle of a game, then the first thing you want to do is count the material, because the material will help you determine what you're trying to do. For instance, if you're down 3 queens, maybe you're looking for a checkmate or a draw by perpetual or something, or a stalemate or something like that. All right, so let's count the material here. White has queen, 2 rooks, 3 minor pieces. Black has a queen, 2 rooks, 3 minor pieces, but white has the 2 bishops and black doesn't. When you're up the bishop pair, that's not the same material. That is ahead by about half a pawn. So white's up by about half a pawn, assuming the bishop pair has some value, which it usually does. Black has doubled e-pawns, but right now the e-pawn on e4 is the more vulnerable one. It's guarded by a knight and it's not attacked at all. Okay, so the material count is white has a slight advantage. All right, what do you do next? Well, you could look at some of the other positional aspects before you look at something dynamic. When I say that, I mean you use your board vision to determine what's going on in the position, and then you can start to look for what happens if people make moves. So we can look at the board and we can, as we saw that doubled pawn, white does not really have a 4-on-2 majority on the queen side because the d pawn is also opposed by the e6 pawn. So it's not really a complete, if that pawn on e6 was, let's say, somewhere else like on f5 or something, then white would have a full 4-on-2 majority. Same thing for black's 5-on-3 on the king side. His e-pawn on e6 is held up by the d-pawn on d4. So it's not a true 5-on-3 on the king side. Anyway, white has 3 pieces out. He has a queen and 2 pieces out. Black has also moved 3 pieces, both knights and the queen, but the queen has gone from d8 to c8, obviously to protect the b7 pawn. So even though black's made 3 moves, the queen on c8 actually is not very well placed. It is blocking the rook on a8 from getting toward the center. Neither side is castled, neither side. White could castle queenside immediately, but he's probably in this kind of position want to castle kingside, even though black has more pawns on the king side, so that white can use his queenside extra pawns to try to come down the board. You're always trying to look for the sides of the board where you have an advantage. The queen on b3 is better placed than the queen on c8. Black is not ready to castle yet. All right, so that's some of the static things. Now we have to look at dynamic things. One of the things that we want to look for is possibilities for tactics for either side. And we want to start with our opponent's possibilities because we want to know if there's something we have to do to stop them. Now, obviously, if we have like mate in 1, we don't care what his threats are. But, you know, black's the one who made the last move, which happens to, in this case to be d takes e4. And we want to know if he's threatening anything. Well, at first glance, it looks like he's not threatening anything. But there is the geometry of chess tactics. I have an earlier video on it's a very well received video on the geometry of chess tactics. And we can see that that bishop and that knight on f4 and h4 are forkable by a pawn. Black could play pawn to g5. Now, obviously, if black plays g5 right away, if white ignores that and black plays g5, white can play bishop takes g5. So you might think, oh, I don't have to do anything about that. Well, on the surface, that looks correct. I mean, let's say you play a move like you develop your king bishop and you play bishop to e2. Then black can't play g5, but he could threaten to play g5. Let's say black plays h6, and then you say, okay, that's not a problem because now he was only threatening to threaten, and now he is threatening g5, and now I can simply move the knight or move the bishop, and he can't fork me. Well, if you stop there, that would be a quiescence error. Let's take a look at that a little bit further. Bishop to e2, h6. Let's say you move your bishop on f4. Let's say you move it someplace safe like bishop d2 or bishop e3 or something like that. Well, he could still play g5. Why would he do that? Well, guess what? He wasn't just threatening one tactic, which was the fork. He's threatening two tactics, which is to trap the knight. Knight on the rim, your future is grim or dim or something like that. And here, it's not just that the knight on h4 is dim, it's that all the moves that it could play are not safe. He can't go to g2, there's a white pawn there. Black's last move, d takes e4, may not look threatening, but it takes away the f3 escape square for the knight on h4. f5 is guarded by the e6 pawn, g6 is guarded by the f and h pawns. So that knight is trapped. So if you play bishop e2 and black plays h6, he actually has two threats. He's threatening g5 to fork the bishop and the knight, but he's also threatening g5 to trap the knight. And therefore, if you wait and you make a move like bishop e2 and he plays h6, and then you say, oh, I'll just move the bishop, then he'll play g5 anyway and the knight is trapped. Now, when I was going over the game with my student, I kind of noticed this right away. One of the things I noticed that's a difference between stronger players and weaker players is stronger players are much more aware of when pieces might get trapped. Weaker players see the fork a lot quicker, but they don't see the trapping of the knight quite so quickly. So that's something you want to work on with your board vision, is seeing if a piece, make sure it always has retreat squares and make sure it has places to go, especially if your opponent does an AWL. If you haven't seen my earlier videos on AWL, attack with something worth less, when somebody attacks a piece with something worth less, it almost always has to move, and that means it has to have retreat squares. Well, what's the only thing that's worth less than the knight on h4? It's a pawn. So that means if black can get a pawn to g5, the knight has to move. And if you can't just guard it against an AWL. So the knight would need a place to go to. Now, my student who was playing this game is not a weak player. He's rated about 1700 USCF. So he figured out that this was a problem. And therefore he played, I think the move that the computer says is the best move. He played g3. We can go ahead and move and see what happens here. Click. I'm on lead chess, so I can click. All right, yeah, he played g3. Now, normally, when you have a bishop on f4, it's not a great idea to play g3 because it takes away retreats from that bishop, and it also, you can't just guard a bishop if a knight attacks it, because if the knight takes the bishop and you take back with the g-pawn, you're not only losing the bishop, losing the advantage of the bishop pair, but you're also getting your pawns doubled and isolated. So having a pawn on g3 is not a great idea, usually positionally, with bishop on f4. But here it's a very good idea, and it has nothing to do with the bishop. It has to do with the fact that white needs to quickly manufacture a square that the knight on h4 can retreat to, so that if black plays h6, and he does move the bishop somewhere, then when black plays g5, white can play knight to g2. Or alternatively, if black plays h6, even more accurate is to play knight g2 immediately. So my student and I had a little discussion about why is knight on h4 to g2 slightly better than moving the bishop first if black plays h6 here. So we'll look at h6. And the reason is it follows the principle, always play the moves, or not always, but you usually want to play the moves that you have to play before the moves that you think you want to play. Well, the only way for the knight to get back in the game is through g2, but the bishop has some scope. And let's say you play knight g2 here, and black never plays g5. Well, then you're perfectly happy to keep the bishop on f4, and even if he does play g5, then you could decide whether you want to play something like bishop e5 or e3 or bishop d2. But the knight's going to have to go back to g2 sooner or later anyway. So whether or not black plays g5, bringing the knight back to g2 is a good idea, while waiting to see if he plays g5 to see if you want to move the bishop is also more efficient. So it's slightly more accurate here to play g3, and then if on h6 to play knight g2. The key to the analysis of this position, of course, is that you have to recognize that black is threatening something. If you look at the position and just use the safety table, which is another one of my videos, the safety table simply says how many times is each square attacked and guarded. Right now the safety table says everything is safe. it says that white's only attacked piece is the pawn on d4. It's guarded by a pawn, it's attacked by a knight, so that pawn is safe, and all the other pieces are pretty much not attacked. So the safety table checks out. The problem is that the safety table is just the starting point for when you're doing safety checks. It's not the be-all and end-all of safety. A lot of times I see intermediate players, they kind of check the safety table. They may not call it the safety table, but they look around and they see everything is adequately guarded, and then they assume that that means everything is safe. And a lot of times there's tricky removal of the guards and other types of basic tactics that can occur that you can do against people at that level because they don't, quote, see it. They just see that each square is adequately guarded, and they assume that's enough for safety. But of course, in a lot of positions, that's not so. Okay, what does white want to do? Well, white wants to stop the threat. Does white have any counter threats he could do? Could he play d5 right away? Doesn't look like it. It's guarded twice, attacked only once. Bishop to b5, not much of a threat. So it looks like stopping that h6 g5 threat is about the best that he can do, and that's why the engine and my student preferred to play g3 here. If you had been watching this game quickly and you saw g3, you might think, oh, white's trying to fianchetto his bishop so he can attack that doubled e-pawn on e4 and then try to win it. But actually, that wasn't the reason for g3 at all. The reason for g3 was to give the knight an escape square to prevent its eventual trapping. So this is one of those rarer positions where it's not someone's threat that's so much a big deal, it's someone's threatening to threaten. If you wait a move and he plays h6, and then he's going to play g5, it's too late because it's a double threat. Even though it's one move, it threatens two different things. It threatens the fork and it threatens to trap the knight. And you can't simultaneously stop both if you wait a move. So for instance, bishop e2, h6, and now g3 is too late because he'll play g5 and fork you. Bishop back to e3 is too late. g5 traps the knight. Okay, so we see that in this position, the safety of our pieces is paramount. We need to make sure all our pieces get in the game. The knight on h4, you might say the knight on h4 has already moved a couple times, so I need to develop the rest of my pieces. Well, that's true, but if you just listed worst pieces on the board, the bishop on f1 is in the way of castling, and it's not very good, but at least it has a nice diagonal that it can move out on. The bishop on f4 and the queen on b3 are well developed. The rook on a1 can get in the game in one move. The rook on h1 is a bad piece, and the knight on h4 is a bad piece. So if we use the principle, find your worst piece and make it better, then moves like g3 or moving the bishop on f1 so that we can castle and get the h-rook in the game would make sense. But from a safety standpoint, which dominates the positional standpoint, we need to save that knight first, so that's why we play g3. All right, let me get another position maybe from the current US Championship that I haven't seen, and we'll try to do the same kind of thing from scratch. Hold on. Okay, I picked a new position. You can see the board has changed color. I've switched from my Lichess board to a chess.com board. This is a game from the US Championship played a couple days ago between Grigory Oparin as white and Ewander Liang as black. And let's see if we can find what happens with the Ewander's move. I put the little window on top of the analysis so I can't see it. All right, so we said when we have a position that we haven't seen before, we're throwing it in cold. We haven't been playing the game. We need to find out what's going on first. We have to use our board vision to figure out what's going on. Okay, so let's count the material. I put it on the black side because Liang eventually won the game, but this is earlier in the game when, you know, it's still competitive. All right, so let's see here. Black has 7 pawns and white only has 6, but white has the bishop pair. So both sides have 3 minor pieces, a rook and a queen. So if you can't count the bishop pair as half a pawn, then the black is up about half a pawn because he's up a pawn, but he's down the bishop pair. Okay, let's take a look at what happened. But black has doubled isolated b pawns, and the pawn on b4 is passed, but it's also relatively vulnerable. The knight that's guarding it is under attack. The bishop on e6 doesn't have a lot of scope. Black's break move with d5 is not going to be possible. There's two white pawns guarding d5, and when two white pawns guard a square, we need another pawn to break it to support the break. But black can break with f5, so playing f5 in this kind of position, maybe not on this move, but very soon, would be a major idea in this kind of position to expand there. All right, you're always looking for your break moves. Let's see if there's anything else statically. White's d-pawn is a little bit backward, but he's got two pieces guarding that square, and there's two pieces attacking it. The knight on h2 is a little out of the game. The knight on g6 is pretty well placed. It's hitting that f4 square. The rook on e8 is not well placed. The e-file is closed. Even if we break with f5, that doesn't necessarily help the rook on e8 that much, maybe a little bit. So the rook on e8 would be either better behind the break move on f8 or on the open file on a8. And also moving the rook would get the knight out of the pin, but that doesn't save the b4 pawn, because let's say black makes a random move here. White could just, even though the knight's pinned, white can just take the knight, and no matter how black takes back, white can play queen takes b4. Is that a big deal? Well, yeah, I mean, it wins that pawn, but it gives up the bishop pair. So if that actually happened, if black did nothing here, and white took off the knight and then won the b4 pawn, the position would be pretty even. We would have a middle game with bishop opposite colors, which can be interesting. Black would have a pawn on c6. He would probably take with that pawn to unisolate the b7 pawn. And then he would have a chance to play a d5 break that might be strong later. So the threat to win that pawn by removing the guard is probably, okay. We could look for ways to stop it, but it's not like it's going to win the game for white, because white is down a pawn, and really all he's doing that way is giving back the pawn, in which case black would have a pretty good position. All right, so now we'll get into a little bit more of the dynamics. What are some of our candidate moves here? Let's say we want to save the b4 pawn. Is there any moves on the board that save the b4 pawn? Well, yes, we could play queen to a5 and guard it. If we play queen to a5, the problem is white could play a move like rook to a1, threatening bishop takes c6, winning a piece, because that would attack our queen. And we don't have any other squares where our queen can move to keep guarding the b4 pawn. We can't go to c5, we can't go to b6. And queen a5, rook a1, what else could white do? I guess black could then play rook a8 to pin the bishop. So let's actually analyze that a little bit. Queen a5, rook a1, rook a8. That looks okay for black, because there's no easy way to guard that rook. I guess white could play rook a2 and then bishop to b3 after rook a8. But white doesn't even have to play rook a1. Let's say queen a5. He could just move the bishop back, or even play bishop to b5 to save the bishop, and then pile up on the b pawn with like rook to b1, and then threaten to take off the knight later after the rook gets to b1. So I'm looking at something like queen a5, bishop to b5. Maybe black can he somehow attack that bishop? And I can't play knight. Well, he can play knight a7, but then bishop takes a7, queen takes a7, queen takes b4. And that's not as good, because even though that gets rid of black's bishop pair, the b7 pawn remains weak and isolated. So that's probably not a good line. Queen a5, bishop b5. Then white's threatening either rook a1 or rook b1. If rook a8, then rook b1. Then we could play queen to a2 maybe. And then white could play bishop takes c6, removing the guard. Queen takes b2, rook takes b2, b takes c6, rook takes b4. That's a lot of moves. That's not very forced. There's a famous little saying called long analysis, wrong analysis. So that's probably not very good. But queen a5 is an interesting candidate move, because it does guard the pawn and hit the bishop. So queen a5 would remain on the list. What else could we play? Well, we could play rook a8 and almost force him to take the knight and win the pawn. Rook a8, bishop takes c6, b takes c6, queen takes b4. You know, black's a little bit better there, but I wonder if queen a5 is better. What else could white play on queen a5? We already said he could play rook a1. So we look queen a5, rook a1, rook a8, and then we looked at a move like rook to a2 so that he could play bishop b3. There's no other way to guard the rook with on a1 with a bishop or anything. Let's see. Well, queen a5 is a reasonable candidate move. Let's see what else we got. We have that break move f5. Let's look at f5 and see what happens if he just wins the b4 pawn. f5, bishop takes c6, b takes c6, queen takes b4. What can we play then for black? If we play f takes e4, black plays d takes e4, and the queen on b4 is guarding the pawn on c4. The pawn on c4 is isolated and fairly weak, but I'm not so sure about that line. Let's look at that again. f5, bishop takes c6, b takes c6, queen takes b4. If we play f4, he can just move the bishop back. I don't think that does anything. Could we then play f3? No, he'll just take it with the knight. f5, bishop takes, pawn takes, queen takes b4, f takes e4, d takes e4. What would black play there? I guess he would just play rook to b8 and hit the queen. If you can't visualize that, I'll show you what I'm looking at. I'm looking at f5, bishop takes, pawn takes, queen takes, pawn takes, and then maybe rook b8 or something. I guess white could have played bishop b6 as his Zwischenzug instead of recapturing on e4 to prevent this. But, you know, I'm not so sure about this. All right, anyway, is that better than just playing queen a5? Suppose I play queen a5 and he guards the bishop with the queen instead, like queen to b3. But then when I play rook to a8, if he plays rook to a1, the rook's not even guarded by the queen anymore. I don't think he would do that. What else do we got? Knight to d4, not so much. Knight to a5 doesn't seem to do much. Let's look at rook to a8 right away. Rook to a8, let's say he tries to win the pawn. Bishop takes c6. I could take with the queen in that line, but I don't really see it. Let's take b takes c6, queen takes b4, and now I can play rook to the 7th rank, but rook to a2, but I don't have any targets. The f2 pawn is well protected. I can't keep attacking it. You know, I'm sort of leaning toward queen a5 as a move. All right, let's see what was played in the game, and let's see what the engine says. In the game, Grandmaster Liang played knight ge7, just overprotecting the knight to guard the pawn so that if black takes the knight, he takes back with the knight. So that's a good candidate move. I should have discussed that, of course. Let's see what the computer says. The computer says the break move f5, letting him win the pawn and then playing f4 is the best line. But it also says you can play rook to b8. Well, the idea of rook to b8 is kind of prophylactic, that if he plays bishop takes c6, you take with the pawn, and now you're going to play c5 and get a protected passed pawn. So he would never do that. The problem with rook b8 is what happens if he doesn't take the knight? Why is that so good? You're not threatening to play b5 or anything. I guess you're just holding that pawn on b4 forever with the threat with the rook on b8. So it's kind of a computerish kind of move to play rook b8. But the break move f5 is also considered equally the best move. Whoops, I just undid that position. Let's go back. Don't want to do that. Clicked on the wrong thing. So f5 right now is the #1 move by the engine. Let's move this over and I'll show you. You see the engine analysis over there? f5 minus 0.72. So the computer actually wants to give up the pawn. So let's go back and look at that line. f5 Bishop takes c6, b takes c6, queen takes b4. And now it says you could play rook b8 first, or you could play f4. Now the computer's, he thinks it doesn't matter whether you play rook b8 first. All right, so now he's saying f4. I looked at this line, but I wasn't sure what we were getting from this. Bishop to b6, hitting the queen. And now the queen goes to d7 or e7. Engine thinks now e7 is slightly better. White brings the knight into the game. Black plays c5. The idea of c5 is to kind of trap this bishop off sides here. Queen a4. Rook b8 hitting that bishop. Now he thinks black's advantage is getting a little bit lower. So rook b8 probably, now he's looking at rook f8. He's kind of changing his mind. Before he had black ahead by about half a pawn, and now it's down to about a third of a pawn. So he thinks this is okay. Let's see what he thinks about the queen a5 move. Queen a5, Mr. Engine, what do you think? Says, yeah, says black's still better by about a fifth of a pawn, maybe a quarter of a pawn. It says he should take the knight anyway and play rook a1 and hit the queen, and now the queen can't guard the pawn. So when the queen goes back to c7, queen takes b4, we're in a similar position that we were before, except that white's controlling more files on the queen side than he was in the f5 line. So black's advantage here is a little bit less, but not a lot less. It's minus 0.31, and that's about what it was in the other line after d5. So actually this queen a5 really isn't much of a mistake either. So in a lot of these lines he's giving back the pawn, and Grandmaster Liang went on and won the game, but in this position when he played knight ge7, we'll go back and show the game here. Knight ge7, we'll show a bunch of moves real fast. White broke, and the computer gives that a question mark. You can see that big question mark on the screen that the engine gives it. Black takes, hits the bishop. Bishop goes back. He puts the knight on e7 back to g6 to hit the bishop. Now the white has made that break move. Penetrates with the rook. Now that pawn on b4 is looking more and more like a passed pawn and less like an isolated weak pawn with all those black pieces over there. White tries to get the knight to the king side, the queen side. Black says, good, I'll get my knight to the king side. Puts his queen. All of a sudden, black's throwing pieces on the king side. Now black has threats on both sides of the board. And white does a pseudo sack, takes the pawn with the rook, even though it's guarded by the knight, because when he takes back with the knight, you can take with the knight and fork the rook and the queen. White says, I'm having none of that. I'll just move my queen over and attack your knight. Black says, I'm getting a bunch of pawns for the exchange. Go ahead, and even if you take my rook now, I can take back and win the exchange. But he is moving into a discovered attack with the bishop. The bishop goes to g5 to do the discovered attack. And black sacks the rook that was attacked by the knight and sacks it on h3. Can't take with the king, it's illegal because of the bishop on e6. If he takes with the pawn, then looks like black has moves like knight f3 check followed by knight takes e1, winning his rook back. So white says, I won't even take it. I'll just attack all your pieces. Now look at all those pieces that are hanging. The rook on h3 is hanging, the bishop on g5 is hanging, the queen on e4 is hanging. The knight on h4 is attacked a couple times. Black says, I'll just trade everything off. And now the rook is guarded by the bishop on e6, which gives him time to take the bishop. And you don't see too many grandmaster positions like this. Black still has 6 pawns and white only has 1. And that 1 pawn he has is attacked twice and guarded 0 times. This game shouldn't last too much longer. Well, he saves the pawn by pushing it because black can't take because he would lose the knight. Black hits the pawn and says, if you take my pawn, I'll take your knight. Let's just show this. If c takes d6, rook takes c1, and if white plays rook takes e5, then rook takes d1. And even that d6 pawn is a goner, so that's why white resigned. Hope you enjoyed today's video about analytical parts, and please tell your friends about my channel, Dan Heisman Chess. If you want to like the video, great. If you want to subscribe to the channel, that would be good too. And you can also follow me with my chess tip of the day on Twitter, on X, /Dan Heisman, DANHEISMAN. I have my chess tip of the day, been doing it since 2009. See you next time.